Okay, my name is Skylar Fielder, and for my paper and presentation, I chose to do it over William James and his theories on consciousness, habit, and emotion. Okay, so who was William James? Well, unlike many of the well-known contributors to the study of psychology, he didn't actually establish a school of thought, he didn't really produce any meaningful research, and he didn't leave behind a dedicated group of students to carry on his work. He even insisted on being referred to as a philosopher rather than a psychologist. Nonetheless, he was deemed crucial to the development of modern psychology in the United States by historians, many of his contemporaries. One of the major reasons for this was because he published American psychology's most famous textbook in 1890, known as The Principles of Psychology. This edition was like 1,400 pages. It was 2 volumes, and because it was so long, he then published a shorter, more condensed version in 1892 called Psychology, the Briefer Course. The first theory of James's I want to talk about is his theory of consciousness. Now, James opposed any analytic approach that presumed to understand consciousness by reducing it to its elements. He believed that trying to identify the individual elements of consciousness and then seeing how they could be reconstructed to form the mind was a meaningless exercise. Because to James, consciousness was not a set of interconnected units. It doesn't appear chopped up in bits, and such words as chain or train don't describe it fitly. Instead, he said, consciousness is nothing jointed, it flows, such as a river or a stream are the metaphors by which it is most naturally described. In James's book, Psychology, the Briefer Course, he recognizes 4 characteristics of psychology. The first characteristic is that it's personal, which basically means, my thoughts are my thoughts, your thoughts are your thoughts. Our thoughts cannot be given or bartered, they are personal to our own consciousness. The second characteristic in consciousness is that it's constantly changing. This doesn't mean that any state has any type of duration, but that no state that has come and gone could ever reoccur identically to the way it was before. The objects can be the same, but there is no proof that we ever received the exact same sensation from the object more than once. Take, for example, a person wakes up every day and goes to a coffee shop. Each and every time that they have that experience, it changes the state of mind. State of mind is ever changing and can never be revisited. The third characteristic of consciousness is that it's continuous. Now, in this context, continuous means without breach, crack, or division. The breaches that can be conceived to occur within the limits of the mind would either be interruptions or time gaps, where the consciousness went out, or would establish a break in the consciousness to where recollection was demolished. Due to the effects of our consciousness being continuous, this means 2 fundamental things. The first is that even if there is a time gap, the consciousness after the gap feels like it belongs with the consciousness before it, which is recollection. The second is that changes between consciousness types, such as being awake and being asleep, are never abrupt. These things are gradual. The fourth characteristic in consciousness is that it's selective. Selective attention and deliberate will are good examples of this. Not many people realize this, but this activity occurs very consistently and on a daily basis. An example would be like the sound of a clock. The ticking sound can be noticeable, but at times it's not. We can assume consciously that the clock is still going even when we can't hear it. We decide to ignore the stimulus because our consciousness chooses where our attention is given based on our interests. The second theory I want to talk about is that his theory of habits. William James believed that every action a person performs is an extension of a habit. An action, thought, or anything else being done by a person is either a new habit being formed or the reinforcement of an old habit. In James's chapter on habit, he uses many analogies to relate his ideas. One of the comparisons made is looking at our physical body when injury occurs. If a person breaks a bone or sprains a muscle, from that point on, they're more likely to re-injure that particular body part. James claims that literally anything that we do in our lives is a relation to a habit. By the age of 30, he believes all of our habits are fixed, and to change or create new habits is an extremely difficult challenge. Like when you hear people talk of older people, like older men especially, being set in their ways, it's basically the same concept. James also believed that habits have an adaptive function. Once an habit is set in stone, they occur almost automatically, which allows our consciousness to focus more attention on more important matters than the actual habit itself. Although in today's society, habit generally has a negative connotation with, it's generally associated with poor practices such as smoking or fingernail biting, they are an essential part of the human experience. Without habit, we'd have to relearn every single thing we do each time we do it. Every time we wanted to walk or talk or get dressed, any action we do that seems so trivial to us, we would have to go through the entire process of rediscovering how to do these things again. Habit extends to literally every single thing that we do, and it would be impossible to achieve anything in our lives without habit. James also had advice on good habit forming. The first piece of advice he gives is recommended making a public pledge about the habit to be developed. So, say you're going to take a break from social media. What's the first thing you do? You get on Facebook and you post a status saying, I'm not going to be on Facebook for a while. Why do you do this? Because it kind of it makes you stick to your word. It gives you, like, you're not going to log right back on and, be like, oh, I'm back, after 20 minutes. That kind of gives you that force that you didn't have before, that you're going to stick to your word. The second piece of advice he gives is that you should never allow any lapses to occur until the new habit is securely rooted. Everyone's heard that it takes 21 days to make or break a habit. Well, he didn't exactly assign a number to it. He basically says don't let yourself fall back into old behaviors until the new behavior has become like second nature to you. The third piece of advice he gives is to rearrange your life to increase the opportunities to act on the new habit. So, say you feel like you don't walk enough. So, when you do go places, you park as far away from the place you're going as you can, and then you walk there, and then you walk while you're there, and then you walk back to your car. Doing this, it makes the new habit come to the forefront so that you're constantly reinforcing that habit, which helps it become more securely rooted in your routine. The last thing I'm going to talk about is James's theory on emotion. This theory appears in the emotion chapter of every modern introductory psychology text. William James criticized contemporary thinking about emotion, which described emotions as, the emotion arising if it happened, to experience the emotion and your bodily reaction to it. So basically, we lose something, we are sorry and we weep. We see a bear, we are frightened and we run. We are insulted, we are angry, and we fight. James's theory, known as the James-Lange theory of emotion, kind of reverses this. His says, the emotion arousing event happens, we react to it, and then we experience the emotion. So basically, we feel sorry because we cry, we are afraid because we tremble, angry because we fight. James's argument was that the bodily changes that are the emotions are felt immediately upon the perception of an emotion arousing stimulus. Prior to the awareness of a cognitively recognizable emotion, our hearts pound before we feel fearful. We recognize different emotions because each one of these emotions is associated with a unique pattern of bodily action. In the case of emotions, practical application was a natural consequence of his theory. If the emotion is the physiological arousal, then the result is that if we could deliberately bring about the bodily changes associated with an emotion, we would experience that emotion. So people whose facial muscles have been arranged to match a certain emotion will experience those emotions, at least to a degree. For example, if you were able to force a smile on your face, you would begin to feel happy or positively about a situation. This assumption is actually supported by 20th century research. In the closing pages of Psychology, the Briefer Course, James says that psychology is not a science, it's only the hope of a science. In his day and age, psychology still had a long ways to go before it could be considered a genuine science. While many of his ideas and theories haven't held up in today's research, many of them actually have. William James, although he wished to be a philosopher rather than a psychologist, is partly responsible for the study of psychology morphing into a genuine science, even after criticizing it and being quoted that he was sick of the association of ideas and all things connected with psychology.